Welcome back to Getting to Grips with the Gospels, our super nerdy series on the 4 most important books in our Bible. This is part 2 of our exploration of the Gospel according to Mark. So far, we've looked at the Gospel's author, at least according to church tradition, John Mark, the son of Mary, whose house was used as a meeting place for the early church, and cousin of Barnabas, who was the great encourager and early missionary. Also a spiritual son to Peter, the head of the church, and a travelling companion of the apostle to the Gentiles, Paul. Mark certainly got around, didn't he? We've also looked at this Gospel's audience, the largely Gentile community of believers located in Rome, who are currently suffering great persecution under Emperor Nero, who, having set fire to massive areas of the city in order to expand his personal residence, blamed the Christians and had them tortured and executed in order to appear just. We also looked at some of the unique features of Mark, such as his apparent haste to communicate the gospel. He sort of races from one story to the next without a moment's pause, not so interested in painting the perfect narrative or presenting Jesus as a theological concept. He doesn't bother with genealogies or birth narratives or even that many appeals to the Hebrew Bible. And finally, we looked at Mark's rather abrupt ending, the women fleeing the tomb, trembling and bewildered. And we considered how that could actually be seen as an invitation for Mark's readers, who were also trembling and bewildered, to trust in the promises of Jesus, that they too would see the resurrected Jesus for themselves. So we've covered quite a lot already, but when it comes to the Bible, there is always more to learn. Before we get back into it, however, let me ask you another somewhat tangential question. What's your favourite oxymoron? Just in case you don't know what an oxymoron is, it's a figure of speech in which apparently contradictory terms appear in conjunction. Classic literature is littered with them. For example, Byron wrote in his famous poem Don Juan of melancholy merriment. In For Whom the Bell Tolls, Hemingway described a first kiss as scolding coolness. Tennyson wrote in his poem The Idylls of the King, his honour rooted in dishonour stood, and faith unfaithful kept him falsely true. And then, of course, there's Shakespeare, who was always a fan of an oxymoron. See how many times you can spot one in this speech from Romeo and Juliet. Here's much to do with hate, but more to do with love. Why then, O brawling love, O loving hate, O anything of nothing first created, O heavy lightness, serious vanity, misshapen chaos of well-meaning forms, feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick health, still waking sleep that is not what it is, this love feel I that love no love in this. Romeo was always a little bit dramatic when it came to love, wasn't he? Of course, we don't need to go to classic literature to find examples of oxymorons. They are all around us. Awfully good, bittersweet, only option, same difference, virtual reality, original copy, passive aggressive, jumbo shrimp. But what I want to suggest to you today is that the best oxymoron of all time can actually be found in the Gospel of Mark. But I'm not going to tell you what it is just yet. You'll have to keep on listening. We established last week that Mark's readers were having a pretty rough time. They were being persecuted and some of them even executed for their faith, which is sadly still a present reality for many Christians in our world today. And so Mark writes his Gospel in order to give his readers hope, to convince them that Jesus is still worth pursuing, even in the face of their present danger. How does he do that? Well, he does it in 2 ways. Firstly, he reminds them of who Jesus is, and secondly, he reminds them of what Jesus came to do. And actually, you can split Mark's gospel straight down the middle. Chapters 1 to 8 focus largely on Jesus' identity, whereas chapters 9 to 16 explore his mission. So let's concern ourselves with his identity first. As we said last week, Mark opens with the words, the beginning of the good news, or gospel, about Jesus the Messiah. Or your version might say Jesus Christ. They both mean the same thing. And then it says, the Son of God. So this is typical Mark. No teasing, no slow unfolding of the mystery. He just says it like it is. Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Done. But of course, this is Mark's opinion, his personal belief, if you like. All that he has seen and experienced has led him to this conclusion. What he needs to do now is provide his readers with enough evidence that they will come to the same conclusion for themselves. Interestingly, there's only one other person in Mark who recognizes Jesus as the Son of God. And it's a little bit unexpected, but we'll get to that later on. So how do you go about proving that someone is the Son of God? Well, I suppose a good place to start would be to have God confirm it, right? Chapter 1, verse 11, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, who I love. With you I am well pleased." Nice. Then, a few verses later, it says Jesus went into Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. The time has come, he said, the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe the good news. So, Jesus claims to be from God. God says he is from God, and he has a message of good news from God. It's all God so far. I told you Mark doesn't mess around, and we're only a few verses in. Already he's thrown so much at us. And as we continue to read through the first half of the gospel, what we see over and over again is this confirmation of Jesus' divine authority. Just come with me for a few moments and I'll show you. Chapter 1, verses 16 to 20, Jesus calls his disciples to follow him, and they immediately leave their jobs and their families to do so. Who has that kind of authority? And then in verse 22, Mark tells us that the people were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority, not as the teachers of the law. And then in verse 23, an evil spirit cries out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Then in verses 29 to 34, Jesus starts healing people and casting out demons, demonstrating his authority over the physical and the spiritual realms. And all of that's just chapter 1. In chapter 2, Mark goes even further. There's this paralytic that's brought to Jesus. And in verse 5, Jesus says to him, "Son, your sins are forgiven." His sins, every act of rebellion against God and his creation, are wiped away just like that. And the teachers of the law respond in verse 7 by saying, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Who indeed? And then at the end of chapter 2, Jesus is challenged about his observance of the law, God's highest authority on earth. He's accused of breaking the Sabbath, the fourth commandment. But he says in verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So not only does Jesus teach with authority, not only does he have authority over the physical and spiritual realms, and not only does he have the authority to forgive sins, he also has authority over the law. And Mark just continues in this vein, proving again and again and again the authority of Jesus. In chapter 4, he tells the wind and the waves to calm down, and they actually listen to him. In chapter 5, he raises a dead girl back to life. In chapter 6, he feeds 5,000 people and then takes a stroll on a lake. Why? Well, because in Job 9 verse 8 it says, God alone stretches out the heavens and treads the waves of the sea. Mark couldn't be any clearer. Jesus is the Son of God. But alongside all of these demonstrations of Jesus' power and authority, we come to another unique feature of Mark, which is that Jesus apparently doesn't want other people to talk about him. I don't know how you feel about other people talking about you. Probably depends on what they're saying, right? Yeah, if you want to tell people that I'm wonderful, then please feel free. But Jesus doesn't seem all that keen. Whenever he's recognized by a demonic force, he tells them to zip it. Like in chapter 1, verse 34, where it says, he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Or chapter 3, verse 12, where it says he gave them strict orders not to tell others about him. But, maybe demon endorsement is not the sort of advertising you want. I guess that only really works out for heavy metal bands. But Jesus also tells people that he healed, to be quiet. Like in chapter 1, verse 44, when he healed the man with leprosy, he said, see that you don't tell this to anyone. And he even said it to his own disciples. When Peter responded to Jesus' question, you are the Christ, in chapter 8, verse 29, it says in the very next verse, Jesus warned them not to tell anyone about him. What a strange motif. The secret saviour. Why is it that Jesus wants his identity kept quiet? Well, over the years, there's been many attempts to explain this, some better than others. But personally, I think Jesus' apparent secrecy has to do with the potential that existed for him to be misunderstood, for him to be seen as the wrong kind of Messiah. You see, in the first half of this gospel, Mark has told us that all authority and power belongs to Jesus, that he is indeed the Son of God. And you can imagine what comfort that must have been to his hearers who were suffering under the authority of the tyrannical Emperor Nero, a man who fancied himself a god. To know that Jesus was the one who really had the power, who really had the authority. This was good news indeed, because they needed rescuing, right? They needed someone who would stand up to the emperor, someone who would set them free from their persecution and suffering. And at this point in the gospel, his readers must have been thinking, this is great. Finally, there's someone that can help us out. But Mark's not quite done yet. Because although Jesus is absolutely the Son of God, the rescue plan was not what anyone expected. In chapter 8, verse 31, it says this, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. It says he spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Peter told Jesus off. Brave man. Either that or he was a bit foolish. Although, I don't think we should be too hard on Pete, because this is where the evidence leads, right? Jesus can heal every disease. He can cure every ailment. He can cast out every demon. He can command the wind and the waves to be quiet. He can feed 5,000 people with a Tesco meal deal. He can bring the dead back to life. Of course, it was inconceivable to him and that he must suffer many things, that he must be rejected and killed. And yet, Jesus insists that this is a part of his story. And indeed, this is where the second half of Mark takes us. In chapter 9:31, he says to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand what he meant, and they were too afraid to ask him about it. And then again in chapter 10, verse 32, it says, again he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. And whenever I read this next bit, I sort of imagine Jesus speaking really slowly. He said, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death. They will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. and 3 days later he will rise. Actually, there's a brilliant bit just before this in chapter 9 where Peter, James and John are with Jesus on the mountain. And I think God gets exasperated with them as well, because he says, "This is my son whom I love. Listen to him." Verse 7. But here's the thing. I think Jesus told the disciples not to tell others about him because they didn't get it yet. They weren't listening close enough. I mean, right after Jesus tells the disciples about his suffering for a third time, James and John say to him, "Let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory." And the other disciples get all huffy about it because they also want a special seat in glory. And so Jesus calls them together and said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And indeed, that's what he does. The last few chapters of Mark's Gospel are really dark. Jesus pours out his soul in the Garden of Gethsemane while his disciples fall asleep. He's arrested and put on trial while his disciples flee and disown him. He's mocked and beaten and spat on just as he said he would be. And as he hangs on the cross covered in darkness, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The opening lines of Psalm 22. And as he breathes his last, we discover the only other person to call Jesus the Son of God, a Roman centurion, who says, "Surely this man was the Son of God." 15:39. And this is the reason why I think Mark's Gospel contains the greatest oxymoron of all time. Because in Mark's Gospel, Jesus is both the mighty Messiah and the suffering servant. Or as the popular hymn by Graham Kendrick calls him, the servant king. I think it's really interesting, actually, that Jesus' final words in Mark's Gospel are a quote from Psalm 22. Let me read a little bit of it for you, and I think you'll see why. It says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. Think again about those to whom Mark was writing. They were feeling forsaken, perhaps abandoned by God. They were certainly crying out in fear and anguish. And so Mark wants them to know that Jesus is the Holy One, the one who can be trusted, the one who gave his life as a ransom for many, the one who has saved them. His hearers were being persecuted for believing in a crucified Saviour, but he wants them to know that the crucifixion was not a mistake, it was the whole point. Jesus had all of the authority, all of the power, and yet he chose to suffer and die for us in order to defeat the powers of sin and death, the greatest enemy that we can face. It allowed his hearers to see their suffering in a new light. Now they were following in the footsteps of their Saviour. They were taking up the cross of the servant king. And so what about us? How should we respond to Mark's good news? Because although the gospel wasn't written to us, it was written for us. I suppose the first thing to say is that if Jesus had all of the power and authority and still suffered in the way that he did, then we shouldn't expect any less. That's not to say that the Christian journey is all about suffering, of course not. But simply that we shouldn't be surprised when it comes. If you will permit me to cheat for a moment and read from another gospel, Jesus said this: "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world." When we suffer in this life, we need to remember that Jesus has gone before us. He knows what it's like to be where we are. And through his victory over sin and death, we have a hope beyond this world, a promise of resurrection and the restoration of all things. How wonderful it is to have a Saviour who's been where we are. But the other way I think we should respond to this gospel message is by asking ourselves, am I truly following in the footsteps of the servant king? Or have I become someone to whom Jesus might say, make sure you don't tell anyone about me, because perhaps he doesn't want us to misrepresent him. I don't know if you've noticed, but one of the main ways Christianity has been under fire recently is because of its abuse of power. There have been a number of prominent leaders who have been accused of using their positions to make themselves above reproach, covering up scandal, blaming victims, all the while living in luxury at the expense of others. And it breaks my heart to see the church come under fire this way, not because I don't think these things should have come to the light, certainly not. I think they must be exposed, but because of how the church has misrepresented Jesus, how the church has made following Jesus about using our power and authority to gain control or just for personal gain. One of the mantras we have in this church is that the greatest you can become in the kingdom of heaven is a servant, echoing Jesus' words in Mark chapter 10. And I think we need to be sure that we don't become like those leaders that Jesus describes, reveling in our own power and authority, but rather we are those who seek to serve the world in love, to give our lives for those in need. You know, I can't put it better than the Apostle Paul does in his letter to the Philippians. This is what he writes in chapter 2. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, by taking on the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. I think if the church wants to be exalted by God, then it needs to get better at making itself lower. After all, Jesus said, whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. This is our God, the servant king, and he calls us now to follow him. And so that's the message of Mark, the mighty Messiah and the suffering servant, the greatest oxymoron of all time. Praise God that we have someone who has been where we are, someone who knows what it is to suffer at the hands of others. But let's also make sure that we aren't those who cause the suffering of others, but rather those who seek to serve the world in love.